Oh, good morning. It's reassuring to see that everyone appears to have survived the 4th of July more or less intact. Shout out to my wife. It was her birthday on the 4th of July. She turned 28, so happy birthday to her. I'm saying that now because I've been told that after you turn 30, I can no longer say your age in sermons. Or I can continue to wish you happy 28th birthday for, the next 20 years or something like that. But anyways, I'm glad that you're all here. We're going to continue our journey through the book of Hebrews, and believe it or not, this journey that we've been on since January is almost over. Just look at the first words of our passage this morning, verse 32, chapter 11. And what more shall I say? For time would fail to tell me of Gideon, Barak, Samson, and all the rest. So, the end is near, right? The writer's, he's worried about time. He's looking back at the clock and thinking, man, I don't know how I'm going to finish this. But of course, we all know kind of the old church joke about what it means when a pastor says, in conclusion, right? He's going to go on for at least another 45 minutes. And that's sort of what the writer does here, because he does go on quite a bit after this. He does say a lot more things about faith. What the writer's actually doing here is he's using a rhetorical technique which is known as apophasis. Apophasis. Thank you to Jack Wilsey for teaching me that term. And what apophasis is it's when you say you're not going to talk about something, and then you go ahead and talk about whatever it is. Like politicians do this sort of thing all the time. I would never bring up the fact that my opponent has been convicted of money laundering. To do so would be unfair. Well, really, he just did. But in the case of verse 32 here, the writer's not doing this with any sort of ill will. He's doing this for the rhetorical effect. Remember, this guy, he's a preacher at heart, a very good preacher, in fact. And this chapter in Hebrews, chapter 11, is one of the finest examples of persuasive speech that we have in the entire Bible. It's like a textbook for ancient rhetoric in a lot of ways. And the speaker, he's using all of his skill, all of his energy to persuade the readers of the critical importance of that one word, the word that's been repeated over and over and over again in this chapter, faith. The righteous shall live by faith. That's how he kind of kicked this theme off back in chapter 10, quoting from the prophet Habakkuk. And then all of chapter 11 is this thrilling, beautiful, persuasive illustration of how you go about doing that. It's a portrait gallery, really. That's kind of how we introduced this chapter when we started it a few weeks ago. You're walking through this elegant gallery where you can admire picture after picture of what faith is, what faith does, where faith gets you. And, we start off this tour at kind of a leisurely stroll in verse 1 about the pace that my mother-in-law likes to go through museums. We have paragraphs kind of about the story. And then verse 32 right here is where this tour really picks up steam. It's like we're sprinting toward the exit. We've got this list of names without any description, and then we got a list of descriptions without any names, just one after another, no conjunctions once you get toward the end, no commas, not even spaces in the original Greek manuscript. It's just boom, 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 and the overall effect of this blitz is stunning when you read it. Or maybe it's not so much stunning as numbing. I mean, we've been in this faith chapter for 4 weeks now, right? 4 weeks of walking through this gallery, gazing at the greats. And if you're like many people, after spending this much time looking at these thrilling portraits of the heroes of the faith, these titans of testimony, the best of the believers, these Abrahams, the Josephs, the Isaacs of the world, toward the end of the tour, you can start to feel a bit fatigued, maybe even a bit inadequate, right? These guys are so great. You look at yourself and you think, what's wrong with me? Have any of you ever felt that way before? Like, I'm reading this massive biography of Winston Churchill right now. I checked out the first volume at the library. I thought it was all 3 volumes because it was 1,000 pages long. The librarian said, no, this is volume 1. When you finish that, then you can come back and get volume 2. It's huge, surprisingly engaging, almost a page turner. I'm 250 pages in right now, and I'm already blown away by what this genius has accomplished in his life. He's only 26 at this point in the story, and Winston Churchill has already graduated from 3 very prestigious schools. He's written a ton of books. He's served in the military in every hemisphere. He's won medals. He just became one of the youngest members ever elected to serve in Parliament. He's 26. I was thrilled to buy my second Corolla at age 26. First one with a CD player, which was a nice upgrade. And then the more I read about Churchill's in his 20s, I think, man, what is wrong with me? Or you could think of another guy from the same era as Churchill, Charles Spurgeon. I ran across this article last week that detailed the daily schedule of Charles Spurgeon, just going day by day through a typical week. It's ridiculous. He woke up early every single morning. He studied. He prayed. He preached 4 superb sermons every week. He taught 2 days in a seminary. He still spent time almost every afternoon to counsel people in his congregation. He wrote books, visited his neighbors, entertained all the elites of London, all while taking an entire day and a half off every week just to spend time in personal study, meditation, time with his family. It's just staggering when you consider the output that this guy had on a weekly basis. And then the article concludes with this little note that he was, by no means some detached megachurch pastor either. He actually knew every single one of his 3,000 congregants by name. I read this to the rest of the staff at one of our meetings this week, and we all just thought, if that doesn't make you feel like a failure as a pastor, nothing will. And this is really, it's the danger of gazing at the greats, the Churchills or the Spurgeons, or in the case of Hebrews, the Abrahams, the Josephs, the Davids. You look at them, you look at yourself, and instead of being inspired to copy them, inspired to move forward in the journey of faith, you're inspired to just, why not give up already? Turn back while you still can. Do I have what it takes to live a life of faith? That's the question we're going to be examining this morning. Do I have what it takes to be like the people in this gallery, to know God, to believe God, to move forward, even in the face of great difficulty? Because obviously these guys were blessed with some extraordinary resources, right? I mean, think of Churchill, born to a very wealthy family, pretty much paid for everything. Social connections really set him up in life. Spurgeon, he was born with this memory that bordered on the photographic. And so were all these heroes from the Old Testament. They had amazing resources as well. They had these special visions from God, supernatural powers and miracles happening right in front of them. They had rods and staffs and umims and thumims and all that sort of stuff. It's like, no wonder these guys attained greatness, right? No wonder they received commendation from God, as the text says in verse 39. No wonder the writer calls them those of whom the world was not worthy. They had everything they needed to get there. So what about us? We just don't have the advantages that these guys were born with, right? We don't have all that extra flashy stuff they had. So what about someone who's, normal, extra average, very, very medium? Anyone here like that? Can someone like you and me live the life of faith? Or are we just going to walk away from this gallery more discouraged than when we entered 4 weeks ago? Well, if that is you, I am so glad that you came in on this beautiful sunny day and decided to come to church, because this last part of the chapter is perfect for anyone with faith fatigue. Because what you see here is that, believe it or not, you have more resources than you could ever imagine. What we see here is that the life of faith is not only possible for someone like you, someone like me, but when you grab hold of the resources that God has provided for you in Jesus, a life of faith is not just possible, but inevitable. But we're not going to start there. That's actually the end of the sermon. So we're going to start by seeing what it doesn't take to live the life of faith, what we don't need. 3 different resources that a lot of us might think are necessary, but actually aren't. Like, I think about when I started backpacking with my brother-in-law, Joel, a few years ago. Joel, you probably remember this. I used to carry a ton of stuff in my backpack I didn't actually need. I remember when we hiked up Tatoosh, I had a full-size pillow. It was luxurious, but I never brought that ever again. Why? I found out I didn't need that. I thought I did, but I was mistaken. The same thing is true for many of us in regard to the life of faith. When we think we often need some of this stuff, these resources, that we actually don't, and the examples in this passage right here can help us identify what some of those things are, and so we can ignore it. So we're going to start right here in part 1 of our passage. It's verse 32 through the first half of verse 35, just the first half. You'll see why in a little bit. Verse 32. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who, through faith, conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead from resurrection. Can you feel the pace that's quickening here, that's picking up steam? You know, with Moses and Abraham, those earlier in the list, we got these paragraphs, kind of the Cliff Notes version of their stories, but here we just get a list of names, list of events, that's it. No backstory. Now, I should say here that there is a backstory for each of these names, each of these events. You could go back, you could find something that matches up with everything he says here somewhere in the Old Testament. The writer just doesn't tell us that. He assumes that his readers know these stories already, and they probably did. I mean, remember, this is the letter to the Hebrews. These are Jews that he's writing to. These are people who have known all these stories since, they were this tall in synagogue school, right? Gideon, Jephthah, Samuel, these guys, they don't need any introduction. They know who they are. Same with all the events that he lists there. The Jewish audience would probably immediately be able to connect names and stories with each item in that list. Like, so can we. Stop the mouths of lions. Any ideas with that one? Probably Daniel, right? Or quenched the power of fire. Makes me think of the 3 guys in the fiery furnace, around the same time as Daniel. Received promises, David, Abraham, Noah, all sorts of guys received promises in the Old Testament. So it's kind of like when some of you people of an earlier generation hear the song American Pie by Don McLean. Anyone know that song? A few of you? Great. Well, you older folks actually probably know what's going on in that song a lot better than someone of a younger generation because you lived through it. It's your history that he's singing about and all those weird references. So, like when he sings about Lenin read a book on Marx, you actually understand what's happening. You might actually remember the headlines about Helter Skelter in a Summer Swelter. You were there, perhaps, when those sergeants played a marching tune. My generation, we hear the name Sergeant Pepper. Cody thinks that's the budget soda that he bought at Safeway last week, right? Case of Sergeant Pepper, case of Mountain Thunder, good to go. Now, that being said, some of you older folks still might not have a clue what's going on with the Chevy Levy, Pink Carnation, all of that. That's okay. The point is this: when the writer and his audience share these same historical, cultural touch points, there simply is no need for any further explanation. In fact, explaining things kind of ruins the effect. Like if you wanted to, you could go online, read a historical interpretation of all the lyrics of American Pie. People have written tons of stuff on this. And that way you can try to understand what's going on with each one of these things. But you know what? By the time that you've done that, the song has lost its impact. You understand it, but it's stale. It's kind of like a joke that you have to explain after you've said the punchline. Ah, yes, I see what you did there. That's amusing. Thank you. So, I'm not really going to spend a lot of time today breaking down the historical background for each item on this list or in the list that follows, because really, doing so could be its own 12-part sermon series. We could just sit down and say, hey, we're going to go through each one of these, preach a sermon on each one of these stories. There's enough depth in there, you could easily do that. But by the time that you finish that series, I think you would have lost a lot of the impact of this particular passage in Hebrews. So, today what we're going to do is we're pretty much going to leave this as the writer does, short references leading to some general observations on the nature of faith. Remember our question: do I have what it takes? Do I have what it takes to live a life of faith? When I look at this portrait gallery of heroes, I look at myself, do I even measure up? And one of the things that can really get us to ask this sort of question is the knowledge that each of us has of our own sinfulness, our own moral failure on a regular basis. We're called to live this victorious life of faith, to quench the power of fire, stop the mouths of lions, go on, obtain kingdoms, all that sort of stuff. But instead, we find that it's impossible to go through an entire day without giving in to lust or lashing out at our family members or griping about our boss, or you could just fill in the blank with any number of these sins that we fall into on a daily basis. And then you look at yourself and you think, I don't have what it takes. If I don't have enough faith to go half a day without sinning, there's no way that I could ever live the life of faith that God is calling me to in this chapter. If that's your thinking, I'm going to invite you to take a closer look at just the first 6 portraits in these verses, the guys who are listed by name in verse 32. And the first portrait we look at is Gideon. Guy who started off great, conquering the Midianites, breaking the jars with the torches and all that. But remember how Gideon's story ends? It ends in idolatry. It ends with him fashioning this ephod out of gold that he worshipped and led all sorts of other people to worship as well. Next on the list, we've got Barak. He's another guy who did some great stuff, but Barak is actually best remembered for being too weak and too scared to lead the Israelites into battle. He actually pleaded with Deborah, you lead them instead. Then we have Samson. Oh, Samson. Time would fail me to tell you of all of Samson's shortcomings, right? He killed a bunch of Philistines. Again, yes, that's commendable, but he also had just this parade of wives and prostitutes and sex partners. Finally ended his life blind, destitute, with a heart full of vengeance, buried under the rubble of a pagan temple. And then the next guy, Jephthah, another one of these guys, his biggest claim to fame is this stupid vow that he made to sacrifice whatever was the first thing he saw when he got home after war. And when he returns to his house, what's the first thing he sees but his daughter running out to meet him, rejoicing and dancing with tambourines because she's so glad that daddy's coming home. Now, I should add here, I don't think that Jephthah actually kills his daughter in the story. I think that the sacrifice meant that she had to live a life of perpetual virginity. If you want to know all the details, Mike Stufflebeam, he could talk to you about this for an hour after the service. So track him down for that. But the point of it is he made a stupid vow, and both he and his daughter had to pay the consequences. Then you've got David. Yes, definitely a man after God's own heart. He was a tremendous king. He was a writer of the Psalms. But he was also a murderer, an adulterer, a liar. Even Samuel. Obviously, Samuel is he's a noble guy. He had his own issues as well. Children that he may have been too lax with. These sons that he appointed as judges that ended up threatening the entire religious system of Israel at the time. Are these the portraits that come to mind when you think of the victorious life of faith of a guy like Gideon bowing down to his idol, or maybe Samson picking out his prostitute for the night, or David gazing at Bathsheba? Is this a mistake? Did the gallery director get this wrong? Should the portraits of these 6 men even be in this gallery next to the greatness of the earlier people, the Enochs, Abels, Abrahams, and Moseses of the gallery? Or is it that when you take a closer look at any of the portraits, these same sort of flaws start to appear? Because David is not the only murderer. You realize on closer inspection that there's a portrait of Moses killing the Egyptian right down the hall. Samson isn't the only guy who liked to party now and then. There's a portrait of Noah passed out drunk and naked on the floor of his tent. You could hang right next to him if you wanted to. Samson also wasn't the only one associated with prostitution. Rahab was a prostitute. Jephthah isn't the only one to struggle with fear. You could hang the portrait of Abraham lying to Pharaoh, or Isaac doing the exact same thing right next to them. You get the point here? Clearly, one thing that it does not take to live the life of faith is moral perfection. Praise God for this. In fact, what we see is that ordinary faith can still be found in people Extraordinary faith can still be found in people with very ordinary flaws, the same flaws found in you and me, everyone else on this planet. So take heart. You may not be perfect, but you can still live the life of faith, made strong out of weakness. That's what the text says. And that really is what the life of faith is all about. And not just moral weakness. Look at part 2 of our text, the second half of 35 to 38. Things take a pretty sharp turn here. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so they might again rise to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains, and in dens and caves of the earth. Wow, that is a pretty sharp turn, isn't it? Just look at the first half of that list, right? The stuff we just looked at in part 1. Conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, made strong out of weakness, mighty in war, people coming back to life. That's what I'm talking about, right? Where do I sign up for that life of faith? And then, verse 35, the sharp U-turn. Don't get whiplash here. Some were tortured, mocking, flogging, chains, imprisonment, goat skins. What is going on here? How did we go from conquering kingdoms to getting sawn in two with a wooden saw, as tradition has it, as if being sawn in two with a metal saw wasn't bad enough? How is that in this portrait gallery of faith? Is this our picture of, victorious life? Like, is this another mistake by the gallery director? Or is once again the writer giving us something here that we should recognize? Here's your second reminder of what it doesn't take to live a life of faith, and that is worldly success. In fact, one of the themes that we see over and over again in the Bible, both in the Old Testament and the New, is that extraordinary faith is shown most clearly through suffering, not victory. Not through God making all of your dreams come true, but through you giving up your dreams for God. That is the life of faith. And really, this is something that goes completely against the way that most of the world thinks. That's why I use the term worldly success there, not worldly in the terms of evil success, the way some people have used the term worldly, but more in the sense of success in the world's eyes, the way that most of the world thinks. Because let's face it, if you're living in a hole in the ground making your own clothes out of goat skin because you were kicked out of regular society for your wacky beliefs, that is not someone that most people in the world are going to look at and say, wow, there's a real winner there. You are living your best life right now. No, that is not the case. The great irony of this passage, though, is that even though all these people listed here are viewed by the world as just total outcasts, these countercultural kooks who are at best weirdos and at worst a threat to society, even though they're seen by the world as worthless, they are, in fact, in the eyes of God, worth more than the entire world. Of whom the world was not worthy. That's what our writer says. Almost as an aside as he's going through this sprint to the finish, like he can't stop but stop this blitz to just, say this. Of whom the world was not worthy. The world doesn't deserve people like this. People of faith, people willing to sacrifice everything in the hope of God's promises. And that is the irony. The world sees them as outcasts, but God sees them as insiders. The world sees them as delusional. God sees them as the most lucid people in the world. The world sees them as deplorable. God sees them as commendable. And in the end, God's approval is the only one that matters. We're going to spend a lot of time next week on this suffering and faith theme, how suffering is an aspect of faith. So I'm just going to set it aside for now, but get this. Worldly success or acclaim or fame or any of that other stuff that's so highly valued by so many people, that's not always an indicator of a life that's worthy. In fact, it's often just the opposite, and that's because the worthy life has very little to do with your performance and everything to do with God's provision. And that gets us to your bonus point. What does it take to live the life of faith? Well, you don't need moral perfection. You don't need worldly success. You also don't need super faith. Now, kind of hear me out on this one, because at first glance, it doesn't seem like this fits Hebrews 11 at all. I mean, Hebrews 11, it's a chapter of radical trust, right? Total belief, super faith. That's why we have this portrait gallery, to bolster our faith, to inspire us to believe. Well, yes and no. You know, a lot of us here, we might get that idea of needing moral perfection, or not needing moral perfection. Okay, not needing worldly success. Check, got that. But what if it is your faith itself that's lacking? You know, what if you're someone who believes in God most of the time? What if you find that you can trust the promises of Jesus in the daylight, but in the darkness of your bedroom you begin to have doubts? You know, you begin to wonder if Christ really cares for you, if Christ really knows what you're going through, if Christ is even alive at all right now, standing in God's presence in your behalf, or if there was some terrible mistake, if maybe there is a corpse rotting in a tomb in Palestine, a corpse that cannot hear your prayers, a corpse that is not coming back to get you. And now you can wake up the next morning and you brush these thoughts off as if they never happened, go on with your life, but then the night returns, and so do some of those thoughts. And you wonder if just, one more little breath of doubt is going to bring your entire life of faith crashing down around you. And then you read this chapter, you read this portrait gallery of faith, this inspirational tour of the greats, and at the end of it, you feel more frightened than ever. I don't have super faith, you think? I barely even have average faith most of the time. So why even try? I clearly don't have what it takes. If that is you, then this bonus point is for you, because what we see over and over again in this entire chapter, from verse 1 all the way to verse 40, is that the life of faith is not based on the strength of your faith. It's based on the strength of the object of your faith. In other words, extraordinary faith isn't special because the belief itself is so special, but because the one believed in is so special. That's what matters. You see this over and over and over again in this chapter. None of these men and women had perfect faith, what you would call super faith. I mean, think of Moses at the burning bush. His first real encounter with Yahweh. He had serious doubts. He pleaded with God to send someone else. He made excuse after excuse after excuse. Yet God used the scrawny faith of Moses in powerful ways because God was strong, and that's what mattered. Same with Abraham. Abraham received God's promise, but then he went and tried to have a son with his wife's maidservant instead of trusting in God's promise alone. Or Gideon. We see him first hiding in a wine press the first time we encounter him in the Bible, and then he's putting out his fleece over and over and over and over again, not just taking God at his word. These guys didn't have super faith, but they did have faith in the one who is super. And that is what mattered. I love the way that Tim Keller illustrates this toward the end of his book, The Reason for God. He describes someone who's falling off a cliff. And as they are falling, don't worry, this is an imaginary story, don't get too concerned, they see that the only thing they can grab onto is this scrawny little tree that's growing outside of the rock. Now, this person might have very serious doubts about this tree. They might think it is way too small, it's way too scraggly, there's no way it's going to hold their weight, and at that point, when they grab on it, it's just going to go down the cliff with them, right? But as long as that person who is falling has enough desperate faith to reach out and grab onto that tree, at that point, it doesn't matter one bit how strong their faith is. The only thing that matters is how strong that tree is. That's it. The same thing is true of our faith. You can have serious doubts. You can have unanswered questions. You can have concerns. But as long as you have faith enough to reach out in desperation and hang on to Jesus for dear life, you've got what it takes to live the life of faith because He is faithful even when we are not. This is truth that should just grant you extraordinary freedom and peace because in the end, the life of faith is not about you and your strength. It's about Jesus and his strength. Which brings us to part 3 of our chapter, verses 39 and 40. The last sentence of this magnificent tour, a sentence that surprisingly turns the focus back on us. Because for the last 40 verses, the writer really has taken us out of the picture for the most part. Us meaning Christians who, like the writer, like the readers, are followers of Jesus Christ. There's been a lot of us in the chapter up to this point, a lot of direct instruction, exhortation. Remember the assignment Bruce gave early on in the series to try to find all the let us verses in the book of Hebrews? There's been a lot of those, but then in chapter 11, the writer takes a break. We leave the exhortation, we enter the gallery, right? Don't think about us for a moment, the writer says. Think about them, those heroes that we see in these portraits of faith. But then all of a sudden, right here in verses 39 and 40, us enters the picture again. The tour stops. We don't quite reach the exit. We don't keep running right on into chapter 12 at this same pace because the last frame in the portrait gallery doesn't contain a painting. It contains a mirror. Before we go on, the writer says, we must look at ourselves, and what we see is stunning. Do I have what it takes to live a life of faith? That is the question we've been asking all along this morning. Do I have what it takes to live a life of significance, of eternal meaning, the kind of life that ends with God's approval, his commendation, the thumbs up from the creator of the universe? Could I ever possibly be classified among these heroes, one of these people of whom the world is not worthy? Or do I simply not have what it takes? This is why the writer makes us look in the mirror. Yes, he says, you do have what it takes. In fact, you've got more than what it takes. Look at verse 39. And all these people on the list, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. Go ahead and underline those words there, something better, because what they emphasize is that this is a comparison verse. Right? It's a comparison between the resources provided for the Old Testament believers and the resources given to us, these people who live and trust in God post-Jesus. And up to this point in this chapter, you might think, how the writer is going to conclude this comparison. The writer's been showing us all these extraordinary people who did extraordinary things by faith, parted the Red Sea, called down fire from heaven, raised the dead, maintained their testimony, even as they were being sawn in two. Obviously, they had extraordinary resources to do this. Moses had his staff. Samuel had direct revelation from God. David had God's special anointing. Samson had his luscious long hair. So do you think the writer is going to make the same sort of point that oftentimes we preachers do when we use these Old Testament guys as examples, which is, we may not have the same strength as Samson, but we can conquer our own Philistines of discouragement and shame. Or we may not have David's sling and stone, but we can still conquer our own Goliath of credit card debt, or something along those lines. A very safe conclusion, a believable conclusion, something that fits with the way that we pretty much already see ourselves, right? Something attainable. But instead, in these verses, in his conclusion, the writer pulls out an absolute shocker. He doesn't just use these last two verses to make a concession, but rather a declaration. The main point, the twist ending of this whole passage, which is in Jesus, God has provided us with everything we need to live an extraordinary life of faith. That is the main point. And then the big twist, this means that even the strongest hero in this chapter had fewer resources for the life of faith than the weakest person who knows Jesus. That is the point of this whole comparison. We have something better. They had faith in the promise. We have faith in the person. They had faith in what was to come. We have faith in what has come. They had faith in future abstractions, visions, prophecies, promises. We have faith in the present reality, the living Savior who has come and has died and is risen and stands right now in the presence of God on our behalf. This is what you have. This is the big twist. You do have what it takes because you have Jesus. And you've had what it takes all along. We've talked a lot this morning about what we don't have, the stuff it doesn't take to live the life of faith. Well, now it's time to talk about what we do have, those glorious resources that God has provided, past tense, for us in Jesus is described throughout the book of Hebrews up to this point, the stuff that the writer sums up in those two words, something better. What's he talking about? Well, look back at the book of Hebrews. First, through Jesus, we have better revelation. In Jesus, we have the most complete picture of who God is that's ever been given to mankind. That's how the writer kicks off the whole letter, actually. Verse 1, he says, long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. By his Son. That is how God has spoken to us. It's like Son is the language that God chose to speak. So what the writer's saying is what's said all over the New Testament is that Jesus, the person, is God's message to the world. He is what God has to say about himself. Jesus is the living, breathing, flesh and blood portrait of the invisible Creator. He is the radiance of God's glory, the writer goes on to say, the exact representation of his being. If you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus. And when you see Jesus, you see that God is more worthy of faith than you ever imagined. We also have a better sacrifice because in Jesus, God has provided for us a once and for all provision for sin. A sacrifice that could do what a mountain of sheep and goat carcasses could never do, which is take away sin forever. Hebrews 9:26. But as it is, he, Jesus, has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Of himself. Jesus is the sacrifice. And because he is God and he is infinite, the sacrifice of Jesus is of infinite value. It doesn't just cover one sin or 100 sins or 1,000,000 sins. It covers every sin of every single person who believes in him for all time permanently. If you know Jesus, you have the best sacrifice anyone on this list, this portrait gallery, could ever imagine, the sacrifice of God himself. And then we also have a better priest. In Jesus, we have the ultimate go-between for God and man, a priest who's not just holy, but compassionate. Who's not just liturgical, but loving, not just divine, but human. In Jesus, we have a priest who is truly God, truly man, equally at home in both worlds, the visible and the invisible, and therefore the perfect representative to serve as the ambassador from God to man and man to God. No hero in this gallery had a priest like that. But we do. A priest who ever lives to make intercession for us. A priest who is praying for us right now to the Father on our behalf. This is why we can live a life of faith. Because we know that even when our faith fails, we have a priest who is faithful for us. This is also why we have better access. Moses, he falls on his face before the burning bush, terrified by even this veiled appearance of God's glory. Abraham, he was put to sleep before God appeared and walked with the fire pots the time of his sacrifices. Even Samuel, God's mouthpiece, the one who was set apart for God's glory, was not permitted to enter the innermost sanctuary. But not us. Because of Jesus, the writer says, we can enter the holiest of holy places. We can approach the throne of grace with confidence. We can step where no one on this list would dare to tread, the holy presence of God himself, and we can do so anytime, anywhere, under any circumstance, because our great high priest has led the way for us in there. The curtain is torn. This is the access that we have. This is why you can live a life of faith. And still there's more, because we also have better ongoing support. We don't have to live this life of faith all alone like many people in this list had to. We have access to our Father through Jesus. We have a great high priest interceding for us. We have the fellowship of believers, all the people in this room who are here to build you up, exhort you, and give you support on your journey of faith. We have the living Spirit of God himself breathing life to our soul and strength to our wills at all time. We have permanent ongoing support that people on this list could only dream about. And this is what God has provided for us in Jesus. Finally, we have a better hope. Hope is the anchor of faith. It is that forward-facing reality that we latch onto and cling to for dear life. And through Jesus, we know that our hope is secure. We don't just, have to hope in the promise of resurrection like the people on this list did. We hope in the one who is risen. We don't just have to hope in the promise of perfection. We can hope in the one who is perfected. We don't just have to hope in the promise of future glory. We can hope in the one who is glorified right now. We can look to Jesus, whose tomb is empty, whose throne is occupied, who's coming back to set all things right one day. And we can know that our future hope is secure. This is why we can live the life of faith, because we can look to Jesus. Really, that is what this all comes down to. Knowing Jesus, looking to him for everything. This is where the writer's going to conclude all of this in the first 3 verses of chapter 12. That's why the writer says here at the end of our passage that apart from us, they should not be made perfect, because it's all about Jesus. What he's saying is that anyone who's ever been saved, anyone who is saved now, anyone who was saved back then in the Old Testament, is saved by the work of Christ, the work of Jesus. There's no other way. The blood of Jesus pays both forward and backward. It pays backward to all those people who trusted in God's promises before Jesus, and it pays forward to all who trust God's promises after Jesus. The blessing of living after Jesus, however, it's all that stuff we just listed off. God has provided something better for us. Not just later, but right now. All we need to do is cling to Jesus for dear life and trust in his provision. That is a life of faith. I want to leave you this morning with a simple 2-part question. Where is God asking you to exercise faith right now? And how can these resources that God has provided in Jesus help you do that? And I want you to do this because this question is going to kind of serve as a link between this week and next week. We're going to revisit this question in next week's passage. How specifically is God asking you to trust him right now? Or another way to think about this question is, what sort of things are making you anxious? What challenges do you expect to be on the near horizon? What are you dreading about the future? What is something that you worry about when you can't sleep at night? Or maybe what is something that you are scared to give up? What is God asking you to do that you don't want to do? Where is God asking you to exercise faith? And to be clear, everybody here should be able to think of something, because no Christian is exempt from the exercise of faith at any time. It's the life that we are all called to live. And it's the life that, really so many of you are already living. In fact, I would just like to end this sermon right now with a brief word of encouragement, because as I was reflecting on this passage this week, I also thought about, I've been at this church my whole life. And I thought about all the different ways, amazing ways, that I've seen people right here in this congregation live a life of faith. I thought it would actually be pretty cool if I took the time to do an entire rewrite of Hebrews chapter 11. To just use the same form that the writer does and everything, but fill in names you're all familiar with. Faces that you who have been at this church for a while would know. Stories that you would remember. But alas, the clock, for time would fail to tell of Alan and Howard and Karen Dubois, Ed Coffey, Susan, Terry, and so many others here in this congregation who have, through faith, endured hardship, financial strain, left your homelands, conquered addiction, changed lives, done all sorts of things in the name of Christ. All of these people and so many others in this congregation, God will commend for their faith, because God has provided something better for them through his Son, and these people grabbed hold of those resources by faith. And I am so excited one day in the new heaven, the new earth, to hear that commendation, to hear that well done from the Creator to these people who I have gotten to watch firsthand demonstrate their lives of faith. That is going to be thrilling. This is the life of faith. This is the life that we were all meant to live. This is the life that so many of you are already living. Next week, we're going to find out how we can live this life forever. So pray with me, please. Father, thank you. Thank you for all that you've given us through Jesus. Thank you for the forgiveness, the support, the ongoing encouragement, the grace to sinners like us. You're so good, Father. Please forgive us for those times that we don't take advantage of these resources the way that we ought to. Forgive us for those times where we look to ourselves rather than looking to your Son. And I ask that by your Spirit, you would help us more and more to live a life of faith, a life of freedom, a life of joy, a life of fruitfulness empowered by you. So we pray all these things in the name of your Son, our anchor of faith, Jesus Christ. Amen.